Hi, guys. Okay, so we're ready for feedback for week 3. And I'm talking about what is coming for week 4, which is the current week we are in case you are unaware. I hope you're aware of that at this point. We are already over halfway through the week. So, week 3, our first assignment was the discussion board assignments on operational definitions for patients. So the main way that you guys lost points for that assignment was not being specific enough in 2 different ways. One way was that you weren't actually giving me an experimental scenario. So remember, an operational definition is not just a generic definition. It is specific to an experimental situation, how you are measuring a variable within an experimental, I almost said experimental experiment. That doesn't make any sense. Within an experimental situation. So you guys may have said something generic like waiting in line or waiting for a reward or something like that, some sort of waiting task, but you didn't elaborate and you didn't explain it in terms of an actual experimental situation. So it needed to be more specific. Like participants would come in and they would be exposed to annoying sounds while waiting for the researcher to come back in to take them to the next room or whatever, but some sort of experimental scenario, right? And that's just an example. Obviously, it could have been anything, but it needed to be more detailed instead of just waiting for a reward or waiting in line, right? It needed to be more detailed. That was part of the experimental scenario part. The other part that you guys weren't specific enough on, or some of you weren't specific enough on, were the measurement part. So remember that experimental or the operational definition has to have a measurement component to it. It's how you are measuring, how you are getting data from these variables. So if you were doing a behavioral measure, then maybe you looked at signs of frustration, behavioral signs of frustration, or impatience, like crossing your arms or sighing or tapping your foot or fidgeting or tapping the table, things like that, rolling your eyes, I don't know, things like that. Maybe you counted how many of those behaviors they exhibited within a certain amount of time, and that was your measure of impatience or patience. Obviously, the higher the value, the more impatient that person was, if that was your scenario. And you see, that's how we get data. That's how we get numbers that we can then plug into statistical equations to get results, to get conclusions on the relationship between these variables. That's how research works. So if you didn't give me a way of measuring the variable to get numbers, to get data, then that's a problem. Now, there are qualitative studies where it's not necessarily about numbers and more about verbal data. But if you had given me an example of that and you had called it qualitative and you told me that's what you were doing, that would have been fine. But for a lot of you guys, you were hinting towards a quantitative study, but you didn't actually tell me how you would get numbers from that. So another example is, instead of a behavioral measure, maybe it was a physiological measure. So maybe you measured blood pressure or heart rate. And so again, those are numbers, right? The higher the blood pressure or the higher the heart rate, you could say maybe they were getting impatient. And again, there's numbers there, there's data there. Or maybe you went the self-report route and there was a survey, and maybe you just presented a survey on impatience or patience, or maybe you put them in an experimental scenario and then gave them a survey to fill out, asking them questions about how they felt during the waiting process. And the higher the scores on that, the more patient they were, or the more impatient they were, or whatever your thing was. But you needed to explain that. You needed to explain what scores would mean in those scenarios and for that operational definition. That all of that is part of an operational definition. And so that segues us into the other part of the prompt, was about that one-to-one relationship. Most of you guys, I think, understood that. It was just, I think you guys had a hard time articulating or explaining how that one-to-one relationship related to whatever experimental scenario you came up with. And so, again, that one-to-one relationship is really getting more at whether or not that measurement, the way that you're choosing to measure the variable or that operational definition, is that truly measuring what you think it's measuring? Is it truly measuring patience, or could it actually be measuring something else along with patience, or could it be measuring something completely different and not even measuring patience? So going back to the examples that I gave, maybe those outward signs of impatience, like crossing your arms, sighing, tapping your toe, things like that, that could be they could be exhibiting that because of patience. But what if it's not? What if you're actually measuring anxiety, or what if you're actually measuring, like I said earlier, I actually said frustration, which is very linked to impatience or to patience, but is that the same thing? I don't know. That's arguable. So, there's definitely some gray area there. So, are you sure that what you chose to do was that actually measuring patience, or could it have been measuring something else? A lot of you guys use the delay gratification method for measuring patience, where you can get a smaller reward now, or you can get a bigger reward later. And so if it was a food related reward, because like with kids, I know a lot of the examples are oftentimes candy or a treat or something like that. If it's food related, are you sure you're measuring patience, or are you measuring hunger? Maybe they didn't wait because they were hungry. It had nothing to do with patience. They were just hungry. And so things like that. Are you sure that you are actually measuring patience, or could you be measuring something else? That's that one-to-one relationship. Measurement, patience. Is it 1-to-1, or is it actually 1-to-2, or is it 1 to something else that's not even patience? And so that's what that was getting at. And I just had another thought, but it left me. It might come back to me. And then the self-report method example that I gave, again, are you sure that those questions are measuring patience, or could those questions actually be assessing something else? Some of you guys did bring up possible confounds or confounding variables, where you talked about, maybe they came into the situation already having some anxiety or stress, and so they weren't very patient, or they wanted to leave, or they didn't wait, or whatever the scenario was, because they had a bad day, or because they were tired, or because that reward wasn't worth it to them, or things like that. And those are all good, and those are all good things to think about. And those are, always being aware of confounding variables and things you might need to control for in order to get a valid experiment and to get that one-to-one relationship as much as possible. Those are all great. But I wanted to make sure that you guys understood that the one-to-one relationship part is really more getting at, are you measuring something else instead, some other variable instead. But those are all great things too, to consider and to think about. And the self-report method, the main problem with that is that, are people actually good at reporting their own perceived level of patience? And most of the time, no. We as human beings are notoriously bad at understanding our own motivations, understanding our own emotions, and all the things. And so that's why self-report measures They can be great, but they need to be taken with caution, and they need to be, that's why having an established measure that has already been previously established in other studies as valid and reliable, using those kinds of tools and measures are better than using something you came up with yourself, using, or for researchers to use something that they just created for that experiment. Now, it's not that there's anything bad with creating new tools. I mean, that's how new tools are created. That's how new measurements are created. They've got to start somewhere, right? People can create their own. You can create your own. There's nothing wrong with that, but it may not be as reliable or as valid as an existing tool that already has shown reliability and validity. And so you just have to be aware that if it is not something that has previously been, valid and reliable, then you have to take the results with a grain of salt, because they may not be completely accurate, because it has not been established as valid or reliable. Because good surveys, good self-report tools have to get around the fact that we as people are bad at reporting our own motivations. And so they have to be worded in a way and constructed in a way that gets to the root of the variable you're trying to assess, like patience, in a valid way that truly measures how they really are and doesn't just measure what they think they are, or doesn't just measure who they'd like to be, but actually measures who they really truly are. Okay, so that kind of segues us into the research analysis project, part one, where you introduce the variables, because that has a huge part of talking about reliability and validity of measurements. But before I get to that, I will say really quickly, the only other thing for the discussion board assignment is that you guys have to interact with at least 2 students. Don't lose points for that. I usually grade those discussion board assignments the next day, like Monday or Tuesday, right after it's due on Sunday. So make sure that you are, I know things happen, but make sure that you guys are trying to post on Wednesday, by Wednesday at the latest, so that gives other people time to read your post and interact between Wednesday and Sunday, because by Sunday, you have to have both of those interactions in, so that when I turn around the next day and start grading, you don't miss points. If it's not there, then I can't give points, obviously, and so I have to take points off. Okay, so segueing back into the research analysis project. Make sure that with all of the projects, or all the parts of the project, because there's going to be one due next week. The next section is going to be due next week. Not this week, but next week. APA formatting, APA formatting, APA formatting, APA formatting. I feel like I say it a lot, but I just hate seeing you guys lose points for APA formatting when there's so many resources and tools available to you. And it's things that are so easy to quickly fix. So, APA formatting, check it all. But also, and make sure that you guys, reach out to me if you have any questions. But also, oh, look, it left me again. I'm telling y'all, I need caffeine. I'm going to drink. Hold on. I'm not firing on all cylinders today. It was something related to APA formatting. It might come back to me in a second. If it does, I'll say it. But I hate for you guys, like I said, to lose points on that. And especially things that are easy to fix. Oh, that's what I was going to say. Yay. Yay. Good job, brain. I know that sometimes when you upload, sometimes your formatting gets wonky. It gets weird. It's not what it was before. If that happens to you, please screenshot what it looks like on your computer before you uploaded, either in Word or your PDF or whatever it is that you're uploading to Blackboard with the correct formatting. Screenshot it and say, this is what it looked like before I uploaded, and email it to me so that I know that Blackboard messed up your formatting. It wasn't that you didn't do it. You did it correctly. It just Blackboard messed it up. So if that happens to you, it takes 2 seconds to take a screenshot and send me a quick email, and I will note that so that you don't lose those APA formatting points. Okay. For the part 1 of the assignment, the identification of variables, I'm still grading some of those. Some of you guys probably obviously realize that I'm still grading the last few of those. So that individual feedback is coming. But what I have seen so far and what I've seen in previous terms, and to help you guys so that you can fix that and make the corrections before the next part is due and before you turn all of this in at the end. Because remember, this is all building, we're adding on as the weeks go on, so that on week 7, you are submitting a completed project that has all of these sections in it. So take this advice and this feedback, your individualized feedback and this group feedback, so that you can make your corrections to these sections. You don't just type it and send it in and then you're done. Make these corrections so that you don't lose points here and then also lose them again on week 7. That's just silly. Don't lose the points twice. Make those corrections. Plus, making those corrections and listening to this feedback and doing all of that helps you learn. And that's why you're here, right? You're learning about research, good and bad, and what it should look like. So for the identification of variables, make sure that you are identifying the variables, number 1. So again, there will be at least 2 variables. In most situations, there's an independent and a dependent variable. If it's a correlational study, then there's likely just 2 continuous variables and it's not labeled independent and dependent. You're just seeing if there's a relationship between the 2. Some studies are more complicated and there will be more than 2 variables. Maybe there's an independent variable and several dependent variables, or several independent variables and a dependent variable, or several dependent variables. Or maybe there's just a whole bunch of correlational variables and they're just trying to see how all of these different things correlate with each other. Fine. But make sure that you are identifying each of those variables. You're explaining what they are, and then you're explaining how they were measured, that operational definition. And it's not just a quick sentence about how they were measured. You need to be as specific as possible, just like in the discussion board post about patients. You need to make sure that you are explaining how they measured it and what those measurements meant, what those scores meant. How did they get data? How did they get numbers from those variables? And what did that look like? What did those measures look like? And then make sure that you are also explaining the reliability and the validity, or assessing the reliability and the validity of those measurements. So that second part is that's the analysis part. So remember, this is called a research analysis project. A lot of students, I think that analysis part is talking about the analysis that the researchers did, like of their research, of what they did in their experiment. That's not why it's called an analysis project. It's called an analysis project because you guys are analyzing the way they did their research. You are learning about the proper and improper ways to conduct research in this course. And in order to test your knowledge on that, you are looking at a piece of research that was conducted and analyzing it. You are telling me the way that they did this was good or bad or could have been better or whatever. So that's how you're explaining to me that you understand these concepts and that you've learned how to conduct proper research from this course. So don't leave out the analysis part. That's the big part of this assignment, okay? So part of evaluating or analyzing the variables section is that reliability and validity component. So you are telling me if you think that the way that they chose to measure those variables was reliable or valid for each variable that was measured, for each measurement tool that they used. Was it reliable? Was it valid? Now, in some research articles, they will tell you it was valid or reliable, and they'll say, here's some reliability coefficients. Here's we did some reliability and validity tests ourselves, and here's what we found on these measures. Some will do that. Some will just say these tools, or this tool, was previously established as reliable and valid. Like I was talking about before in the discussion board post about using tools that are previously established as reliable and valid. That is obviously great if it's been previously established as reliable and valid. So if they say that, then you tell me that. Say the authors said that this was, previously established as reliable and valid, and they may even give a citation for that, or like I said, some kind of statistical numbers to go with backing that up. But you need to you need to back up what you're saying about the reliability and the validity with some citations, either from the article itself or from the articles that they referenced, where it's been previously established as reliable and valid. And then if they didn't say any of that, if they said nothing about the reliability and validity of their tools or their measurement, then you need to say that. Say they did not discuss the reliability and validity of these measurement, of these tools or the way that they measured it, and explain why that's a problem. And the reason that's a problem is because how can other researchers replicate their research? Science is all about replication, right? How can they replicate their research to see if they get the same results if they don't have any idea how they did it? So they have to make sure they tell you how they measured it and whether it was reliable and valid. The other problem with that is, with the reliability and validity part of it, is if they don't tell you anything about the reliability and validity, how do you know that you can trust the results that they found and the data that they got? Because if you have no idea if it's a reliable or valid tool, then the results they got could be incorrect. They could be invalid or not reliable. So again, you need to make sure that you say all of that. You are also allowed to have an opinion, as I've mentioned in the current research reflection assignments. Tell me if you don't think, even if it was established as reliable and valid, if you don't think that was a great choice for a way they did it, if you think there's a better way they could have measured the variables, say that. If you think there's a better tool out there they could have used, say that. If you agree with it, that's fine. Say that. Whatever you say, make sure that you are giving a reason for your choice. Whether you think it's reliable or valid or not, make sure you're explaining why you think that, backing up, supporting your answer, right? Okay, so the only other thing from that assignment was your introductions. So a lot of you guys, I think, got confused. I don't know if you didn't look back at the sample student paper that I attached to the prompt. Please look at those. It's a very quick and easy way for you guys to see what this should look like. But I think some of you guys got confused about that part. And so some of you guys actually provided the annotated bibliography and then some sort of introduction and then the identification of variables. You don't need to do that. That's redundant. That annotated bibliography part was just to help you summarize and choose an article. So what you're using that summary for is part of your introduction. So your research analysis project, you're going to begin, okay? It starts with an introduction. You're introducing the article that you're going to be analyzing to the reader. So the first part of that is going to be a summary. So you're introducing the article and you're summarizing the article. Remember that summaries need to give 1 to 2 sentences about the purpose of the research, what the research question was or what they were trying to do, the hypothesis or hypotheses, if there's more than one, that they had, what they thought was going to happen, and then how they measured their variables. Again, this is just 1 to 2 sentences about each of these things. It shouldn't be super, super long. How they measured and what the procedure was. What did the participants experience? What tools did they use to measure their variables? And then what did they find? What were their results? What were their conclusions? Again, just a couple sentences about each of those things. So in total, it should be 8 to 10 sentences, maybe a paragraph, not super long, but also not super short. I need to make sure that you address all of those parts so that I understand, so that the reader understands what this article was about. Again, you're introducing it, you're summarizing it, you're introducing the article. At the end of a summary in life and in this course, there also needs to be something where you relate back to either how this applies to the world at large and the greater population, but it's like your segue into whatever the next part of your assignment is. So for current research reflection, you may be talking about how this was good for the general population, and then that segues you into talking about your critical reflection or critical thinking questions that you have to answer for the current research reflection assignment. For this assignment, you are segueing into the analysis. So you could say something after you talk about the results of the conclusions, part of your summary. You can say something that says, in the current paper, the research will be analyzed, and the following sections or the following topics will be addressed. And you can even say, identification of variables, ethics, participants, and research methods, the different sections that we're going to be doing throughout the course that are going to complete your research analysis project. The reason it's a good idea to say that is, one, it guides you, but I've always been told, and I will stick with this, I think it's a great tip, is that it's always a good idea when you're writing a paper to, in the introduction, tell the reader what you're going to tell them, and then in the body of the paper, tell them, and then at the end of the paper, in your conclusion, tell them what you told them. So that's a great way to keep you on track, but also to make sure that your reader clearly understands what you were trying to say in your paper. You're giving them 3 opportunities, and obviously the body of the paper is going to be a whole lot more fleshed out than the introduction and the conclusion, but it's just a way of saying, here's a little bit about what I'm going to tell you, and then here I'm going to elaborate on all of that, and then at the end I'm going to say, this is what I just told you. This is a little bit of a wrap up of what I just told you. So that introduction part, again, needs to encompass the summary and introducing the article, and then at the end segues you into the analysis part, which again is going to begin with the identification of variables heading, and then you do all of your identification of variable section, and then for next week it's going to lead into the ethics and the participants. Okay, those 2 sections. So yeah, if you guys have any questions about any of that, let me know. So really quickly, we're going to go over a few of the questions that I think confused you guys a little bit on the quiz. Quiz 3. One of the questions was, actually 2 of the questions were about correlational relationships, negative and positive relationships. Remember, negative does not mean less or low. A lot of times people think that's what that means. Negative relationship in terms of a correlation means that the 2 variables are moving in opposite directions of each other. Think about a magnet. It's repelling. They're moving in opposite directions. A positive relationship means they move up or down together. So they can move down. So down does not mean negative. They can move down for a positive relationship, but they're moving together at the same time. Negative means they're moving in opposite directions. So two of the examples that confused you guys, or 2 of the scenarios that confused you guys, people spending less time on TV, the less likely they are to score high on measures of materialism. Well, that's 2 low things. Less time, less materialism. Less time on TV, less materialism. So that's moving together. They're both lowering together. So that's a positive relationship. Again, those less than terms makes you think negative, but that means they're just moving together. You have to see if they match. That's the key here. If they match, they're moving together, it's a positive relationship, not negative. The other one was fewer electronic devices, the less likely they are to be addicted to the internet. Again, less electronics, less addicted to the internet. So moving together. The more exercise a child gets from age 2 to 7, the lower their chances are of having cancer by age 65. So more exercise, lower chance of cancer. So those are moving in opposite directions. So you could flip it the other way and say the higher their chance of cancer, the less exercise that they did from age 2 to 7. Again, moving opposite directions, okay? Not matching. So that is what defines a negative relationship. And I think, let me see if the other one, so the other example, another question was more red meat that they eat from age 15 to 25, the higher their cholesterol at age 60. So again, positive relationship. Now, one of the answers that tripped you guys up also was cause and effect. Some of you guys said that was a cause and effect relationship. It could be. It could be a cause and effect relationship. However, from the information provided in this example, remember that whole correlation is not causation. Correlation does not equal causation. You cannot assume that that is true based on the information provided, because it does not say that there was an actual experimental scenario performed where they ruled out all the other variables and all of that. Only a truly experimental scenario can lead to cause and effect determination. All this says is that there was data that said that there was high amounts of red meat, then there was higher cholesterol in those same participants. They correlate. That doesn't mean that necessarily one causes the other. They're just correlated. They're just related. And so it could be a cause and effect in relationship, but you cannot determine that from the information provided. So the only true answer here would be positive relationship, because you can definitely determine that because they're moving together. But the other one you cannot determine. My chair keeps creaking and making weird sounds. I apologize. Okay. Another question was about scales of measurement. A person's reaction time. Some of you guys thought the answer was interval scale instead of ratio scale. Remember, the difference between interval and ratio is that interval is like temperature. It doesn't have a true zero. So there can be negative temperature. There can be negative 4 degrees, because 0 does not actually mean that there is an absence of something. 0 degrees doesn't mean there's an absence of temperature. There's still temperature. It's just 0 is just a reference point. So that's an interval. Time, reaction time, does have an absolute 0. If you're at 0, there's no reaction time. 0 means that there was the reaction, the timer didn't start, right? So, and also another way to look at it is there's no negative time. Can't go back in time, although some people would argue that. But in terms of how we measure time, you can't, the stopwatch isn't going to give you negative numbers, right? So a ratio has a true 0, and only, there's no negative numbers. It is a true 0. Okay. Let's see. I know there was at least one more. Oh, yes. Study reports that participants who scored high on a new test measuring relationship satisfaction had more physical contact with their partners during interview, and the ones who scored low on satisfaction had less physical contact with their romantic partners during the interview. Assuming that more physical contact has been previously associated with higher relationship satisfaction, this study demonstrates what? Your answers were kind of all over the place. What this is getting at is that predictive validity. Here's how you know that. Because it's saying that previously established in previous studies showed that more physical contact was associated with or correlated with higher relationship satisfaction. And this study is showing that is confirming that, because this study showed that the higher that they tested in satisfaction, the more physical contact they had during the interview. And those that scored lower on satisfaction didn't have as much physical contact. They avoided physical contact with their partner during the interview. So that confirms what was previously established. So that's an example of predictive validity, because remember, predictive validity is doing exactly that. It is saying we're assuming that this will happen based on that. So the results here are confirming what would have been predicted based on the previous research. So that's what that is saying. So it was saying that theory, that's giving it predictive validity because that study confirmed what was already assumed to happen. Let me make sure. I think that's it. Yeah. Okay. So that was it. All right. So really quickly, we're going to go through what's going on this week. Let me go here. Go to week 4 because this video is already over what I wanted time-wise. Okay, so this week, remember we're talking about ethics. Make sure you review those overview and objectives. Make sure you read chapter 4. You're watching the 5 psychology experiments video that you couldn't do today. Again, failure in ethics. And then for your JASP assignment, you're watching that video on how to export results in JASP. You're just following along with the video and doing what it says on JASP on your computer, following along with him on your JASP, and then submitting what it tells you to do as you follow along. If you've not watched the JASP videos from last week, you need to go back and watch those. If you haven't downloaded the software, obviously you need to download that. There's the guide and the link to download it in this folder as well. You also have the Lockdown Browser requirement. If you've not used Lockdown Browser before on your computer, you need to read all of that and do all of that. Even if you have used Lockdown Browser before, you still need to do that practice test to make sure that your Lockdown Browser is working correctly so that you can resolve any issues with that technical issues before you try to do the midterm, because I don't want you to panic email me at the last minute when you're trying to do your midterm and your Lockdown Browser is not working. Okay, don't do that to yourself. I don't want you to stress. So don't do that. So another thing is, hint, hint, if you're watching this video, you get some insider information for watching this video. If you complete that practice test, that Lockdown Browser practice test, there may be some bonus points available for you. So I would highly recommend that as soon as possible, if you've not already done so, complete that Lockdown Browser practice test. It takes 5 seconds, and you will make sure that your Lockdown Browser is working. You may get some bonus points, hint, hint, and you will have peace of mind that it's working so that you can do your midterm. And do that as soon as you can, so that if it's not working, you can reach out to me or IT and get that resolved before your midterm. So for assignments, obviously you have your midterm, but you also have that week 4 JASP assignment that we just talked about. And then you also have another current research reflection assignment. Make sure you look at your week 1 current research reflection assignment feedback, your individual feedback, but also you can go back and watch the week 1 feedback video, which is posted in week 2, and see what I said about the current research reflection assignments, so that you don't make those same mistakes on this current research reflection assignment. Obviously, you're picking a different article and you're doing another topic, but the content should still be similar and the feedback still applies. So make sure that you guys do that so that you can get the most points and that you are learning from your mistakes. And then speaking of getting the most points, I've been asked for ways to study for the midterm, and I posted this in the announcements, I think, on Tuesday, but make sure that you're reviewing all of those overview and objectives that are at the top of each content folder. They're also in your beginning of your book, in your textbook, each chapter. Make sure that you are reviewing the chapter exercises in the book that are like throughout the chapter, and then there's some at the end of the chapter. Make sure you understand all of those questions. Make sure that you have looked back at your quizzes from weeks 1, 2, and 3, and that you understand why you got answers. If you got them wrong, why they were wrong, and make sure you understand why the correct answers are correct. And as always, if you have any questions about anything, I'm here. Just reach out to me via email. And I think that's all I have for you guys. So have a great week. And I will see you guys probably on Monday, because I probably won't be posting anything until then. So have a good week. Bye.